Good afternoon. Good to see all of you. I know we still have people in the line out in the lunch area right now, but we're going to go ahead and get the program started. My name is Tim Gable. Normally Don Bailey would be up here making this introduction. This is part of the RTI Fellow Symposium, but Don's somewhere across the Atlantic right now, so you're stuck with me. But I want to welcome all of you, and I want to especially welcome Dr. Sharon Boivin here as our speaker to talk about recent developments in federal data policy. I told her before we started, you know, federal data policy probably touches 90% of everything that goes on at RTI in some form or fashion, and so it's really looking forward to your remarks and looking forward to it. But I want to give you a little bit of bioinformation about Sharon, and I'll start by saying I can't remember when we first met. And I need some reverse mentoring from some of you early career folks to teach me how to go into LinkedIn and know when a LinkedIn connection started, because I couldn't figure it out, but I was trying. But Sharon's been in the field of education research and policy analysis for a long time, over 30 years. Got her PhD, did her PhD work at the University of Virginia. Had been at NCES for a while, and I think, Sharon, we're going to have to get you like an RTI alumni badge or something, because an interesting fact for all of you, Sharon worked 10 years for NPR Associates. So I know that some of you here that worked at NPR worked with Sharon at NPR, and of course RTI and NPR merged back in 2012, and so by some kind of 2 degrees of separation, that makes you part of the family here, Sharon, so welcome. But in 2008, Sharon went back to NCES and began working on the preparation and credentialing of adults, this part I'm reading, and founded and served as the chair of the Interagency Working Group on Expanded Measures of Enrollment and Attainment. And this group was developing and validating survey items on the prevalence and characteristics of certifications, licenses, and other non-degree credentials among the U.S. adult population. And as many of you know, especially those of you that work in the workforce development side of things, this notion of badging and credentialing and all the ways that we can track adult education in the U.S. is an ever-changing field. But very recently, Sharon, having served as a senior research and policy analyst for the Commission of Evidence-Based Policymaking, she has now moved to the OMB and is currently on detail at the Office of Management and Budget, supporting the development of a federal approach to leveraging data as a strategic asset. So I think you'll agree with me that this is a very critical topic to those of us here at RTI, and something we're very interested in hearing about. So with that, I introduce Dr. Sharon Boivin.
Let's see, is this working? Can you all hear me? Should I use my teacher voice? Oh, there, I hear it. Okay, great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the invitation to come here and speak with you today. As Tim said, I have had, been working with people at RTI for most of my 30-year career, and, including my time with NPR Associates, and I'm really proud to say that now my son is working here as a research assistant, and I'm so thrilled that he's with such a respected and wonderful company. So I'm really glad to be here. In the past couple of years, I've been involved, as Tim said, in some really interesting efforts on thinking about how the government could make better use of the data it already collects. So today I'm going to share some of that with you. I'm going to have to go pretty quickly because there's a lot to cover, but I am going to leave some time for questions, and I hope that you'll be thinking of those as we go along. And I also understand from Jennifer that there's going to be an opportunity afterwards if people want to hear more or go in more depth for us. All right, so today I'm going to talk about 3 topics and a sidebar. So as Tim said, I was privileged for a year to serve as a full-time staff member to the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. I'm going to talk a little bit about that commission and its process, and then about the recommendations. And at the end of that term, I worked with some congressional staff to help develop legislative specs for the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the provisions of that and where that stands in the legislative process. Then I'm going to pull a thread with this sidebar. Last week, the president released the reorganization proposal, which I'm sure many of you have read about. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what I've been doing since I've been at OMB for the past couple of months. So first, the commission. I need another hand. All right. So I think it's important to note that the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking was a bipartisan effort. It was the result of legislation that was co-sponsored by Paul Ryan and Senator Murray, and it had broad bipartisan support. The commission was designed to look at the federal government's data and think about how we could use it better and more effectively to create evidence, how we could make better decisions using the data that the government already collects instead of always going out and collecting new data. The commission was created back in March 2016, and it has 15 commissioners who were selected by the president and by the leaders of Congress from both parties. So there was a lot of both political diversity, but there was also a lot of diversity of expertise. 5 of the commissioners were chosen explicitly for their expertise in confidentiality and data privacy, and the rest were experts in program administration, data, or research. So the commission spent 8 months in what we called its fact-finding phase, and there was a lot of research and input that went into that phase. It included, for example, a request for comments that got over 350 submitted comments, and I'll note that there was a very thoughtful one that came from RTI, so we appreciated that. And afterwards, we kind of went into closed session for several months to deliberate, and the commissioners thought about the implications of what they had learned and what kind of recommendations they would like to make for improving how the government uses the data that it already collects. In the end, they were distilled into 22 recommendations, which amazingly were endorsed unanimously by all the commissioners. So this was bipartisan, it was multi-skill set, it was people who came from very different perspectives, all agreed that these were the recommendations that they wanted to put forward. So the commission had a vision, which was a future in which rigorous evidence is created efficiently as a routine part of government operations and used to construct effective public policy. Let me talk for a minute just about what we mean by the term evidence, okay? Evidence means statistical uses of data. It means making inferences about groups so that you can understand the impact of policies or programs. It does not mean making decisions that affect individuals. That's really important because the scope of the commission's work really focused on how to provide secure access to confidential government data, whether it's statistical data collected with a pledge of confidentiality, or whether it's program data, protected health information, for example, or tax data collected under the Privacy Act or other laws that require the protection of the privacy and confidentiality of the individual. But they wanted to think about how they could use these data more effectively to construct public policy. So here on the little picture that is from the cover of the report, you'll see the 5 principles that guided the commission's work: transparency, privacy, rigor, capacity, and my favorite, humility. It's one I hadn't seen in any other principles anywhere, and I want to read it to you because you'll see why it's my favorite. Care should be taken not to generalize from findings that may be specific to a particular study or context. That's the scientific method, right? You don't just say that you've done something once and now we know the answer. So I just love that humility principle. Okay. So the themes in the commission report included improved access to data. So this involved access, which we all know can be difficult at times, especially to get to the government's confidential data. It had also included facilitating linkage of data sets, because one of the things the commissioners really cared about was trying to use the data that the government already had rather than starting a new data collection because you couldn't get the data from that agency for this purpose. So secure linkage of data sets. Stronger privacy. I'm also going to tell you about a recommendation within that category that I think you might be interested in. One of the recommendations in this category was that the government should develop a single streamlined process for external researchers to apply and qualify for secure access to confidential government data. Why? Because now if you go to NCES and you go to Census and you go to BLS and you go to NCHS, you have to go through 4 different data stewardship trainings and go through 4 different qualification systems, and it just didn't make sense to not have a single process for external researchers to qualify for access to confidential government data. Now, does that mean that the IRS may not have some additional requirements? Well, of course, but at least there ought to be a baseline. Yes, I've done the data stewardship training for the federal government. Stronger privacy protections. As I said, 5 of the commissioners were really focused on privacy and confidentiality, and this was very, very important to the commission. You'll notice if you ever read the commission report that there is a chapter on privacy, but it is also very clear that privacy actually infuses the whole report and all of the recommendations. So the idea is to make privacy protections both more uniform and more dynamic. There are new risks to privacy today. There's big data, there's more computing power, there's greater risk of re-identification because you put data out there and all of a sudden you have the technology and the data that's electronic that you can start matching to it, the mosaic effect, and you have a greater risk that somebody to whom you have given a pledge of confidentiality could have their data re-identified. So that was really important. 2 of the recommendations that I'll highlight under there were a requirement that under CIPC, the confidentiality law that governs most statistical agencies, and the Privacy Act, that agencies should conduct comprehensive risk assessments before they release a public use file. So if you're releasing a public use file from some Privacy Act data, you still need to look at what other data sets are available out there that could be matched to that. That's what the commission was interested in seeing happen. Also, adopting new privacy protecting technologies. There's so much out there, secure multi-party computation, differential privacy, all sorts of things that are now just sort of coming into conversation. And you know, the government's a little bit of a dinosaur. It takes a while to move the bar in there. So thinking about how we can pilot some of these things in a way that can show that it can work in the government context. And sort of related to both access and privacy is something that I know RTI has really been a leader in for many years, which is the concept of tiered access. Not only do we have restricted use data and we have open data, weather data and such, but there's all sorts of levels in between. Data query tools like Data Lab and other ways that we can produce less sensitive versions of a data set that still protect privacy and confidentiality so that researchers could go in at a lower level where the bar is not so high to get access, figure out if they can answer that question from that, and if they can't, then they start jumping the hoops to go higher up. So that's a really important concept that's not actually mentioned in the recommendations, but that's one of those things that is very clear in the text that that's part of the intent. And then capacity. So there's a lot of capacity issues in the federal government. You all know it, I know it. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the recommendations. One I'll talk more about is this idea of establishing a single entity. But I also wanted to tell you that they recommended that each agency have a learning agenda. So what's that? The agency should be thinking about what are our top priority research and evaluation questions. They should be looking around to see what the data are that will inform those research and evaluation questions. And then they should say, well, if we can't get that data, we have to figure out how to get that data because that's a priority question. So then you start creating demand for figuring out the access and the linkage issues. And then, oh, you're going to love this one. Aligning administrative processes with evidence-building activities, including OMB clearance. So making it easier, maybe not easier, but a little bit more nimble, a little bit more efficient, so that you don't have to spend so long on OMB clearance that the program that you were supposed to evaluate has already ended before you even get approval to collect the data. And the other thing is procurement, right? Because when we're doing a long-term longitudinal study and we have to have 5 severable contracts to do it, it's not very efficient for you, and it's not very efficient for the federal government. It wastes a lot of time and resources for both of us. Okay, so this recommendation on the key recommendation that kind of goes throughout the report is that there should be a national secure data service that would help facilitate access while protecting privacy, bringing all the best practice to bear on privacy and confidentiality, and that would promote transparency in how the data are used. Now, interestingly, one of our privacy commissioners said, transparency isn't just about telling people what you're doing. Transparency is about privacy. Privacy is not secrecy. Transparency promotes privacy because you're telling people how you're using the data. If you're being secret about how you're using the data, then you can use it for nefarious purposes. But if you're being transparent, it actually protects privacy. So why do we need this? Well, the Census Bureau has some capacity for securely linking and analyzing confidential data, but they're focused, rightfully so, on census purposes. And they have Title 13, which we all know causes all sorts of issues. And, they have capacity and resources to do what they're supposed to do. They're not specifically tasked with providing the needs for all government agencies. Similarly, we envision this as a hub where states or outside researchers could have a single portal into the federal government confidential data, where an RTI team could say, we need these data linked for these purposes, and NSDS would do the data minimization to make sure you only got the data you needed for that purpose. That approved purpose would be posted on a portal so that everybody could see what the data were going to be used for and why. And then they would do the analysis, maybe using secure multi-party computation, maybe using differential privacy, whatever the state of the art is, and then you get your result back. So the idea would be to provide that access and ability. It would also be a place in the federal government that really could be the R&D hub, the place where they were trying these new technologies, trying to figure out how they work and whether they work in the government context, so that they could say to agencies eventually, hey, this works, we're doing it here, you should be doing it in your place. So it wouldn't be like NCES could no longer release their own restricted data, but it would be eventually that NSDS would demonstrate that this particular method of protecting privacy was really working and doable, and then eventually OMB would set a standard saying, this is how we do this in the federal government. So with the sunsetting of the commission in September of 2017, the work around these recommendations and the implementation steps were taken over by the Bipartisan Policy Center. And they have been working, they've developed an evidence initiative, and they've been working really to publicize the recommendations, to work with Congress on legislation around that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the status of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. So Ryan and Murray actually actively engaged with the commission and the commission staff all through the process of developing the recommendations. They got to peek behind the closed door a little bit. While we were talking, they got some previews of what the commission was thinking. And it was really good because when we released the report on September 7th, they said, we're going to propose legislation that'll be like a down payment legislation for implementing these recommendations. So there was a hearing, and then they co-filed the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act in the House and Senate. It covered 10 of the recommendations, including an advisory council for an implementation plan for NSDS. The second one, I think, will be really interesting to you. So I mentioned CIPSI already. Many of you nodded like you know what I'm talking about. The Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act of 2002, which is the law that is a very strict law that promises confidentiality to subjects, respondents in statistical surveys for principal statistical agencies. So CIPSI is actually a footnote in the Paperwork Reduction Act, which means it isn't directly itself in the U.S. Code. And one thing this law does is it elevates CIPSI to the U.S. Code, which gives it kind of more authority and visibility. It also modifies CIPSI a little bit, and it says that statistical agencies are authorized to take program data into the CIPSI island, if you will, and protect it under CIPSI. It doesn't say just in my agency. It says program data, so administrative data being collected by another agency, unless otherwise prohibited by law. So it doesn't solve the tax data problem under Title 26. It doesn't solve the Title 13 data for census data, but it does say that that should be the default. Yes, unless, okay? Comprehensive risk assessments I've talked about, Chief Evaluation Officer and Learning Agenda. The bill was passed by unanimous consent in the House. There have been some procedural glitches in the Senate, as you can imagine. We do think that it may still be passed this year, maybe after the November elections. And they're already planning phase 2 legislation. So developing legislative specs for the authorization of the National Secure Data Service, to start looking at those exceptions, those laws that don't let the data be used for evidence. We're talking evidence building, secure use of confidential data for statistical purposes, not for decisions affecting individuals. Improve wage and earnings data, which was a huge issue that came up a lot during the commission findings, and also providing additional resources so that the federal government can expand its evidence building. Okay, how am I doing on time? Oh, quite well, good. Here's my sidebar. I'm going to pull a thread here. Last week, you may have heard that the president released the reorganization proposal. You've probably all heard about the proposal to combine Ed and Department of Labor. That's the one that's been big in the news. But I'm going to focus a little bit on a less covered proposal that directly affects statistical agencies. So the document's called Delivering Government Solutions in the 21st Century. And one of the proposals is called Reorganizing Economic Statistical Agencies under the Department of Commerce. So that's Census, BLS, and BEA. Now, we all know that Census has more than economic data. They have a ton of demographic data as well. But the goals are to, increase operational efficiency, reduce redundancy, combine their IT systems and their HR systems, and modernize and pull everything together to increase efficiency. Probably the biggest thing that would come out of this is all of these agencies have their own frames of establishments, that is businesses. So there are 3 different frames, and that's not only inefficient, it's not good for data quality, right? Because you don't know that the frames are exactly the same. Another benefit of having them all use the same frame is that you will know that the data that are being produced, the statistics that are being produced, are based upon a common frame, and it will allow for the production of new statistical estimates. Now let's pull that privacy thread for a minute. If you have 3 different agencies producing different products about businesses, then you're increasing the risk of re-identification every time you release a statistic that purports to cover the same thing. So it would also help enhance privacy protections. It's interesting, well, let me pull the thread first, the thread from the commission recommendations. This calls for a planning period that would begin in 2019, and the implementation would happen in 2020 after the decennial census is over. Part of this planning, the thought is, could be, how does NSDS come out of this merger? Because that is a lot of the resources in the federal government that have capacity for securely combining and analyzing confidential data. So it makes a lot of sense to think about that in conjunction with this. This This recommendation is strongly supported by the Chief Statistician of the United States, Nancy Potok, and she's had numerous conversations with the Interagency Council on Statistical Policy about this. The reorganization proposal, just a sidebar for a sidebar, also includes a proposal to strengthen federal evaluation government-wide by including a requirement for learning agendas. So that links back to the CEP recommendations. And it also links forward to what I'm going to talk about next, which is leveraging data as a strategic asset. Tim mentioned this. So leveraging data as a strategic asset is the name of a cross-agency priority goal, or a CAP goal. I've learned a whole new set of acronyms since I've been at OMB, under the President's Management Agenda. So first of all, everybody doesn't know what a President's Management Agenda is. Let me start there. The President's Management Agenda is released every 2 years. It was released this year in March. And basically, it's a series of goals that purport to help the government operate better and more efficiently. And they've been things over the years like IT modernization. Open data was a big one. You know, how many data sets has each agency released on data.gov, for example? And the ones that have existed for a while all have well-established benchmarks, milestones. The agencies report every single quarter, to those benchmarks with their new milestones. But this March, we had this new data and a unique data goal, this new CAP goal that is unique. So why is it unique? First of all, it's unique because it hadn't been around before. Second of all, it's focusing on developing a government-wide comprehensive data strategy. And there are no established goals and milestones, so this year is really focused on figuring out what does a federal data strategy look like, what are the best practices, what are some of the action steps that could be taken by federal agencies to get to the point where they're implementing those best practices, and what are the principles that underline what a federal data strategy should look like. This is broader than the Commission's scope. The Commission's scope, as I've said several times, was narrowly, if you could say that, confidential data for evidence-building purposes. This includes not only statistical data, it includes administrative data, both confidential and non-protected data, and it includes another category that most of the time we don't think about when we're thinking about decision-making or about external use, and that is mission support data. Things like performance metrics, HR data, financial management data. So it's really all the different kinds of data. So I wanted to show you this. These are the goal leaders. It includes people from offices within the Executive Office of the President, as well as executives in the Department of Commerce and the Small Business Administration. I think it's interesting to note that two of these goal leaders are the Chief Statistician of the U.S. and the Federal CIO. Some of you may know that statistical agencies and CIOs have not always gotten along that well in agencies, and that there have been conflicts in their priorities because of their unique responsibilities in that respect. So the fact that the Chief Statistician and the Federal CIO are working hand in glove on this CAP goal is really a movement forward. It starts to bust the silos that exist in OMB, and we hope that it will start to bust the same silos in the agencies. Quick overview, you can read this sometime. I'm sure we'll send out the slides, won't we, Jennifer, or something. But I think that I want to point out a couple things. In the end of the challenge statement, the purpose is to deliver on mission, serve customers, and steward resources while protecting privacy and confidentiality. We hammer that home all the time. And the opportunity, this is both for internal users and external users. It's for decision-making and accountability within the federal government, but it's also so that businesses can take advantage of federal data and commercialize it and create a billion-dollar weather app industry using NOAA data. So it's for multiple purposes, and I'm going to show you kind of the overall look at it. There are 4 areas that the federal data strategy is focusing on. I'm going to start with the bottom 2, the purple and red areas. These are the purposes for which federal data are being used. So on the right is decision-making and accountability. That's really about program evaluation, performance management, how the government uses its own data to make decisions about policies and programs and what its priorities are going to be. It also very intentionally includes the role of external contractors who support the government in doing these things. So how do we make sure that those data are being used effectively for those purposes? Commercialization, innovation, and public use is about how do we make the federal government's data available so that people can think about neat ways it could be used and could be commercialized and how we could innovate on it. And interestingly, it includes the role of federal statistics in promoting civic engagement, knowledge of the state of our nation, and helping businesses and markets run more efficiently. Enabling these two purposes is the access, use, and augmentation area, which is just what it sounds like. How do we get access to the data? How do we use the data securely if necessary? And how do we augment or link different data sets so that we can make meaning where we couldn't make meaning before? All around this is this issue of enterprise data governance. How do we bring the right people in the room to talk about how we're going to steward the data, how we're going to use the data, what the priorities are? The learning agendas start getting in that direction because it forces the agency senior leadership to say, what are our priorities? But a lot of times you still have the statistical agencies over here, maybe the chief data officers over there, the CIO's office is over there, the financial management people are over here, and they don't talk to one another. So as a statistical agency, how do you create a new statistical product, for example, that requires the use of an administrative data set, and then the administrative data set changes because they didn't even think about the fact that it was being used for a statistical purpose? So those kinds of conversations have to happen at that enterprise data governance level. So those of you who know NCES might be interested to know that one of these working groups, the green access, use, and augmentation one, we've had a very competitive process to select people to staff working groups in these areas. And we had an application process for what we're calling federal data fellows. And we had a number of very highly qualified applications. And we now have 4 working groups where we've solicited, we've engaged leaders of those working groups, and we're in the process of selecting the membership. And Matt Green, who used to work on iPads and then went to FSA, and now he's at PPSS, he's the leader of the Access, Use, and Augmentation Group, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have him. My current role in this process is I'm the liaison to all of the working groups. So my role is to make sure that the working groups, we're establishing charters, we're helping them understand what's in scope and what's out of scope. We're looking for both synergies across the groups and making sure there aren't gaps that we want to have filled. So it's a very interesting and engaging process. So what will they be doing? I was telling some of you that we just had a release, our quarterly release on Tuesday. So this is hot off the presses, just came out on Tuesday. And I want you to focus on the top half. This is the development of the federal data strategy. So we just hit the first milestone, and I can't even read that, July of 2018, where we released draft principles. I think we had a set of 10 principles in 3 areas, if I can remember them: stewardship, data quality, data stewardship, data quality, and continuous improvement. And then there are some principles nested under each of those. We've put those out for public comment, and we've also done a call for best practices. Talk a little bit more about that later. Next quarter in October, we'll be releasing the final principles, and we will be releasing draft practices. These are the best practices that the working groups will come up with under each of their areas. Then in January, we will be releasing the principles and practices, and we will have a draft year 1 action plan. We're going to look at lots and lots of actions and then prioritize and kind of put them on a timeline and say what has to come first. And we're going to come up with the year 1. And then we'll put that out for comment. And then in January, we'll release the year 1 action plan. After that, through the next several months, we'll be thinking about, okay, well, now that we've thought about that, what are the next steps? So we'll kind of lay out a longer term strategy, but that won't be part of that. The bottom half is really, what we're calling the data incubator. That's an opportunity to take a couple of high impact projects that are high visibility where we can show quick wins, quick successes, examples, stories that the policymakers can tell about why using data is really valuable for all sorts of public interest purposes. All right, this is my ask. Strategy.data.gov just got stood up on Tuesday. It includes all of these things, a request for people to comment on draft principles, questions about the best practices for each of those 4 areas. We're calling for use cases. What are some good examples of how federal data are being used for decision-making, accountability, commercialization, innovation, public use? Not just successes, but where are there challenges that we're still working to overcome, and what lessons can we learn from those? Those will be used both as inputs to the working group so that they can figure out what's really going on. They'll also be used, very few of them will be selected for the incubator. And finally, we're asking everybody to suggest mechanisms for stakeholder engagement. There is a link to the request for comments, which was published on Wednesday, and there's also a web form. And I didn't put this on the slide because it just got started and there's really not much traffic, but we do have a hashtag, Fed Data Strategy, all one word. So this is our first quarterly release. We will have 2 more RFCs, that's the plan. Each one will ask for comments on what we just released and input for the next process, part of the process. And here are some resources for you to take a look at. CEP report, read the report, not just the executive summary. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Foundations bill, the BPC evidence initiative, you can keep track of where that bill is and what's happening with it. The reorganization proposal and the CAP goal, where you can get a lot more details about each of these 4 areas. And I left some time for questions, did I not? All right. So, thank you. So who wants to talk about this? Yeah.
Hey, my name's Emily. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm with the data science team here at RTI.
Oh, great.
And I was wondering whether you could speak, you spoke about transparency earlier as well as data privacy. And one thing that we encounter a lot working with particularly machine learning algorithms is a lack of transparency, because it's very challenging to explain what we're doing to somebody who doesn't have a statistical or data science background. So I was wondering if you had any conversations about that when you guys were kind of developing your plans, and kind of how you see machine learning in particular fitting in with some of the work that you guys are doing.
Well, we definitely think things like machine learning, natural language processing, AI, are all things that we need to be considering and pulling those tools into our toolkit, right? There are a couple of issues that we're thinking about along those lines. One is ethics, one is quality, one is practicability. So in ethics, we want to make sure that we don't make decisions just because the machine told us to, right? In quality, we want to make sure that we're actually doing at least as well, if not better, using these tools than we were doing it the other way. Because if we're losing quality, this is not a good path to take. And third, practicality. The federal government, as I said, is a big dinosaur. It's like a whaling vessel. It's not a nimble jet boat. So you have to really think hard about how do you implement these things in a pilot fashion first and show its applicability and replicability. So I absolutely think that that's part of it. Oh, by the way, we have a group of people who are subject matter experts to the federal data strategy. I had a conversation with Kimberly this morning that put in my head, hey, we'd only been thinking about feds, but now we're thinking about non-feds who might want to be subject matter experts as well. I modified my spreadsheet this morning to add a tab for non-feds. So if any of you are interested in being subject matter experts, that the working groups could say, hey, we're thinking about machine learning and we know somebody at RTI who knows about machine learning, that would be cool. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Sharon, thanks for the talk. I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to frame this question, but it gets down to the statement in one of your slides about, data being the underpinning of a democratic society or something. Mm-hmm. This construct of having a centralized kind of data system and all that foundational to that is actually having good quality data in it.
Absolutely.
And, you know, for us, much of the primary data collection that goes on as response rates are going down, as costs are going up, the pressures, I know in our agency relationships, it's clear that it just costs more and more and more and more to get this data. And yet, if it's going to be inferential data and so forth,
it has to be good.
It has to be quality.
Yeah.
And that pressure between cost and quality trade-offs,
yeah.
I think we see it in most across the spectrum of the federal agencies that we work with. They're wrestling with it. We're trying to help them wrestle with it.
Right.
And just wondering to what extent you all talked about the sustainability of a data system when it gets more and more challenging to actually put high quality data into it.
Well, I'll see you and I'll raise you.
Okay.
Because not only do we need to think about data quality so that we know that the decisions that we're making are based on good data, otherwise why bother, right? But we also need high quality data because we can't take advantage of any of these upcoming technologies unless we have really good metadata that is clean.
Yes.
You know, many of these administrative data sets, they've just been collecting like, you know, it's kind of like the chaff that comes off the wheat. It's something you throw away because that wasn't the purpose. That's not your mission. You don't go out and give people Social Security dollars so that you can collect their data. You do it to help people, right? But these are really valuable data that have to be curated, that have to have really good metadata. You can't do secure multi-party computation unless you have good, consistent metadata. So one of the very important focuses of the Access, Use, and Augmentation group is going to be thinking about data inventories and metadata, and how do we ensure that the data really are high quality. The other thing that it made me think of, actually, your question, Emily, made me think of it too, is the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, which many of you may be familiar with, has a blended data quality reporting project, pilot project underway. Same sort of thing. It relates to transparency and it relates to quality. Because how do you make sure that you tell people what you're doing to ensure quality without telling them so much that you risk violating confidentiality? So there's definitely a balance. There are all sorts of balances here, Tim, but yeah, that's a really good one. The whole resource issue is, you know, that's the scary one because it underpins all of this. None of this can be done without resources. That's why I was encouraged to learn that in this phase 2 legislation, Congress is thinking about sort of what are the resources necessary to do that. Of course, the official commission talking point on resources is that if we really do this well and right, and it will require an upfront investment, there'll be efficiencies that will result in it paying for itself, exactly. And we'll learn what programs and policies don't work, so we won't go down the road of continuing to spend money on those, you know, so, but then you worry about, okay, if they're gonna make those kind of high-risk decisions about programs, you know, what incentives do programs have to participate in any kind of data quality or sharing? So, you know, it's not only resources, it's not only quality, it's also a culture issue. How do you shift the culture to help federal agencies, both leadership and staff, understand the value of doing this? Thank you. Yeah.
Speaking of trade-offs, you've used the dinosaur analogy a couple of times now. I've been known to use that myself before too, okay. So I'm with you there. The commission did really solid, outstanding work. I think on one of the very first slides you had, one of the words under one of the bullets was dynamic.
Dynamic, yes, privacy protections.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how much of the commission's focus was on the ability to be dynamic, given the pace of technology change and given the pace of change overall, and if we can, if the commission talked at all about sort of getting there faster,
yeah.
And once the commission's recommendations are established, they're going to need to undergo revision right away.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the commission was very aware that this is not a static world and that technology is changing every day, computational power is changing every day. The ability to analyze, in particular, big data, there's a heck of a lot of work being done out there. You know, there's this whole Pacific corridor where they have this huge network now with very high capacity that's really exploring what we can do. that was one of the reasons that the Commission thought the National Secure Data Service should be this hub of research and development for the federal government. We know the federal government will likely not be a leader in these things, but the federal government needs to be a consistent adopter when it becomes operational, practical, and feasible. So, for example, the NSDS could, do some, in fact, the Bipartisan Policy Center is doing an SMC pilot using federal data. I can't tell you more details about it because we've had some brief conversations about it, but I'm not even sure they've decided on the actual project. But I know they're doing a pilot. And the Commission understood that you couldn't just say, okay, we're done. We're not going to think about this anymore because we solved the problem. There's no such thing as solving the problem. There has to be an ongoing, and that's the capacity. And the capacity includes having data scientists, establishing, an evaluation series at OPM where there currently is not one. So you can hire a statistician to do evaluation, or you can hire a program analyst to do evaluation, or you can look for, but you don't have a series for that. And really figuring out how to make sure that the culture understands that this is an ongoing process. I actually think in an interesting way, the partnership with the CIO's office is going to help us with that because they're used to thinking in that way. More than program offices, more than statistical agencies. So a little bit of my Pollyanna optimism coming through there. Anyone else?
We have a question online from Daryl. He asks about the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. That initiative started under Obama. Has there been any change in the commitment to evidence-based policymaking? Some examples related to why he asked the question is executive branch decisions based on rely on my gut, and this is how I feel.
So thank you for the question, Daryl. I appreciate it. I am here representing the Executive Office of the President today. So I do want to say that the current leadership is extremely supportive of all of these efforts to use federal data to make more solid decisions. The political leadership in OMB is 100% behind this. So Margaret Weichert, who's the Deputy Director for Management, is the biggest champion of the leveraging data as a strategic asset goal. And she started to use the phrase data stewardship, which really makes me happy. In addition, the President's budget talks about evidence. The President's reorganization proposal that just came out, if you look at the very last pages where it talks about the learning agenda, it talks about evidence, evidence, evidence. Follow Nick Hart, Nick-Hart on Twitter. He's the leader of the Evidence Initiative at BPC, and he's done several articles about how things that have come out of the Trump administration have signaled support for evidence and evidence-based policymaking. So again, Pollyanna optimism, but it's really clear that this is a bipartisan issue. Now, are there individuals in government that poo-poo the value of data? Sure. They're all over the country. But are there a core of dedicated individuals who really believe that this is right and this is the way to go and this is the only way that government should operate is based upon information that tells us what's really going on? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. This was fun.